I'm Hugh Patrick from Columbia's Center on Japanese Economy and Business. I welcome you to this special event, which is co-sponsored by the Weatherhead East Asian Institute and the Center on Japanese Economy and Business. I'm glad to see such a full crowd. As you both noticed, Jerry and I came and sat down earlier because we didn't have anywhere else to sit, and then we're so pleased to see so many friends, old friends, and what I trust will be new friends at the end of this occasion. Following the Professor Curtis's lecture, we will have a Q&A from you all, and we'll end about 6:30, and we'll have a reception outside for almost an hour, and then you'll have a chance to ask further questions of Professor Curtis and also chat with each other. One of my honors and pleasures at Columbia is to introduce our speaker on special occasions like this. Gerald Curtis, Burgess Professor of Political Science. You have his bio, which sort of nicely, superficially describes him. I think he's the most knowledgeable specialist on Japanese politics in the United States, or indeed anywhere outside Japan. He usually spends, as it says there, the spring semester in Japan and returns sometimes in the early summer, as again he did this year. It's never boring to listen to what Jerry has to say about Japanese politics, but I have to say one theme is getting really repetitive. Every September for the last 5 or 6 years, I don't remember how long anymore, ever since Professor Koizumi, that's not professor, we haven't promoted him yet, Prime Minister Koizumi, ever since then, whenever Professor Curtis gives his lecture, it turns out Japan has a brand new prime minister, you know, and it's usually been elected to the Diet only a few weeks earlier in September. And this year, of course, once again, we have a new Prime Minister, Yoshiko Noda. Of course, it's only coincidental that the academic year starts, Jerry gives a lecture, and we have a new Prime Minister. But it's a curious coincidence, and I guess my thinking is that it has something to do with the fact that each Prime Minister wants to stay for at least a year, and maybe the first one started in September 5 or 6 years ago. I'm not sure. We'll ask Kay or Jerry or somebody else to explain that to me. We really benefit from the fact that Professor Curtis has known every Japanese Prime Minister pretty well for the last 30 years, except for one who only lasted a couple of months and couldn't get around to Jerry or vice versa. Indeed, you know, he knows the political spectrum leaders from the Liberal Democratic Party, the Democratic Party of Japan, Komeito, and others. He has this extensive network of politicians, business leaders, and government officials in Japan. And with them, he's developed what is really an indispensable insider-outsider kind of a relationship. He's an outsider because he's not Japanese, because he's an academic, and because he has no hidden agenda or particular axe to grind. He's an insider because he is fluent in Japanese, and he is trustworthy in not revealing information from private conversations that he's not supposed to, and because he can and does express himself very frankly to these leaders as well as in public fora like this. As you know, Japanese politics are really turbulent and in ways far broader than having a new prime minister. The March 11 triple disaster, the earthquake, the tsunami, and the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant breakdown have added a complexity to Japanese politics and Japanese political situation. I guess as a simple-minded economist, my view of Japanese politics is that they're a mess. But unfortunately, it's not a uniquely Japanese phenomenon. Maybe Jerry will have something to say about that. At any rate, as always, I look forward to the perceptions, insights, and explanations of Professor Curtis. Jerry?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to see so many people here. I know some of you are a captive audience. The students in my class, they had no choice. They had to be here. But the rest of you, and even they could have escaped, and I wouldn't have known the difference. But I see a lot of them, which is good. And I'm glad to see so many other people turned out for this event. As Hugh just said, it's another new semester. It's another new prime minister. I've given this lecture 7 times. I think there have been, I think I did it when the first year, I think Koizumi was still prime minister, or I was on his way out. Every year it's been somebody new. I don't want to predict how long Prime Minister Noda is going to last. I hope, and I think anybody who wishes Japan well hopes that he will provide a stable government and effective leadership and stay around for a while. But the situation that Prime Minister Noda faces is beset by all kinds of great difficulties. And I want to start out by just reminding ourselves what some of those difficulties are. Then I want to go on and talk a little bit about what lessons should be drawn from the disaster, the triple disaster that hit Japan on March 11th, and then make some concluding remarks. I hope I don't go on all that long because I want to give you time for some questions, but there are a lot of things that I have on my mind that I want to share with you. So what are some of the difficulties that this government and this prime minister face? The first is that he faces a divided parliament. You know that his party, the Democrats, they don't control the majority in the upper house. He faces a divided parliament and an opposition that's determined to try to force an early election. They need the government to fail so that they can win the next election whenever it's held. Just like the Republicans in the United States, the LDP talks about cooperation and it doesn't mean it. And just like President Obama, there is only one way for Prime Minister Noda to prevail. He has to persuade the public that what he wants to do is what they would want the government to do, and have the public put the pressure on the opposition and on the DPJ itself to do what the Prime Minister asks. Many years ago, when I was a student here at Columbia, there was a professor here in my department, political science department, who shortly thereafter left and founded the Kennedy School at Harvard. His name was Richard Neustadt. And he got it exactly right. In his book, Presidential Power, he defined the power of the president as the power to persuade. That's what Obama has to do. He has to persuade Congress. He has to persuade the public to put pressure on Congress. It's what Prime Minister Noda has to do. He has to use that bully pulpit, as we say. He has to use his position to persuade his people, his countrymen, that this is what's necessary to do. Now, what is the this? That's what we're waiting to hear from Prime Minister Noda. What does he really want to do? But the point here is that dealing with a divided parliament, or in this country, a divided Congress, one house controlled by the Republicans, the other by the Democrats, that just presents a huge challenge to a leader to use his persuasive powers to get things done. The second difficulty he faces is a deeply divided party of his own, the DPJ. It's divided by factions. It's looking more and more like the old LDP. There's an Ozawa faction and a Maehara faction and another faction here and another faction there. It's divided by deep policy differences. Some, like Mr. Noda himself, want to see a tax increase, at least a temporary tax increase. Others are dead set against it. It's not at all clear what the DPJ stands for. So how do you maneuver when you have an opposition that controls the upper house and your own party is deeply divided. Mr. Ozawa, who's been, who's outside the party now because he's been indicted for corruption, and his trial will start soon. But if it concludes next spring with a non-guilty verdict, well, then Mr. Ozawa will be back. He's a major player anyway. He'll be even more so. So what happens? How do you manage in this party? There's another difficulty he faces, and that is a mass media that turns every gaffe by a politician into a front page story, and that is more focused on personalities and on rankings of politicians and parties in public opinion polls than it is on policy. It seems to me that reforming Japan's mass media is one of the most important challenges, not to Mr. Noda, because he can't do it, but to the media itself. And this lack of attention to policy and the overemphasis on personality and on factions and who's doing what to whom. In Japanese, there's a term, seikyoku. Seikyoku is kind of politicking. The political department in the newspapers, they're not seijibu, which is what they're called in Japanese, the political department. They're the seikyokubu. They write about gossip. And it's it's an increasingly problematic problem and difficult. And so Noda needs a media strategy. One thing to be said about Prime Minister Koizumi, he knew that one essential element in his to be successful was a successful media strategy. And he had somebody who was responsible for managing the media and was very good at it. And Koizumi, as you know, himself was very good at it. What else? You have all these difficulties that this prime minister, who's on an airplane, I think he's on the airplane right now, or else he may have landed already in New York, but he's here for the General Assembly. In addition to these kinds of problems the prime minister faces, he faces the problem of the sheer complexity of the issues that he has to contend with. And we don't have time to, in my opening remarks here, to go through all of them, but let me just indicate a few of the major ones. Japan needs a new energy policy in the aftermath of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant disaster. When the DPJ came into office about 2 years ago, it promised that they would increase reliance on nuclear energy to 50% of total energy needs by 2030. Now they're talking about reducing it to 0. Well, they're not going to 0. They're not going to 0 anytime soon, but the public pressure to reduce as quickly as possible reliance on nuclear energy is very strong, and I don't think it's going to dissipate with time. But there's no policies in place yet to provide real incentives for developing renewable energy sources. There is an effort to encourage Japanese, to provide government funds to encourage Japanese companies to buy access to natural resources abroad, but this is very much a policy still in the making. Japan needs a new energy policy. Noda, unlike his predecessor, Prime Minister Kanu, said we're going to get out of nuclear, no nuclear within 25 years or so. Noda is not saying that. Noda is much more cautious, and we should reduce it as much as possible, as quickly as possible, because he's concerned, for good reason, about the economic impact for getting out of nuclear. And Japan faces a very immediate problem in this area, in that these nuclear power reactors, they have to go offline every so often for maintenance. And those that have gone offline since March 11th, now one of them has come back online because the local communities are scared to death to let these nuclear power plants start up again. So if that doesn't change, by next spring, there will be no nuclear power plants in operation in Japan. How do you deal with this? How does he convince the public to let these plants come back online? There was a demonstration in Tokyo just a few days ago. Government says 20,000 people. The organizers say 60 or 70,000 people protesting nuclear energy. There's no simple issue. And this is a tough issue. Second, this prime minister has to figure out how to pay for the reconstruction of Tōhoku, of the disaster areas in Tōhoku, in the context of severe fiscal constraints. How do you do that? Well, he has a proposal. He has a view on this issue, which is to have a temporary tax increase. Temporary meaning, Noda says, about 10 years. For the next 10 years, first the government will borrow about 11 to 12, 13 trillion yen to help pay for the Tōhoku reconstruction, and then repay that from this tax. And the tax commission of the government, I can talk to you about this later if you want to know the details, but they've offered several options, and Noda has rejected the idea of increasing the consumption tax for this purpose, although he thinks there should be a consumption tax increase, but not for this purpose. But for Tōhoku reconstruction, increase personal tax, income tax. There's going to be a 5% reduction in the corporate, 40% corporate tax next March, but take back 2% of that and have that 2% go for Tōhoku reconstruction, and increase local taxes. Well, I think the chances of this policy being adopted are about the same as the chance that Obama's Jobs for America and Tax the Millionaires proposal will be adopted by the US Congress. In other words, the chance is practically zero. It's not going to happen. But he's walked out on a limb, Noda has, on this tax proposal. And if it doesn't happen, how does that make him look? It's a tough issue. Another, they have to revise what the party promised in its so-called manifesto, its party platform, when it won power. Because times have changed, circumstances have changed. The economic constraints are much more severe than they were when the DPJ took office. What is this party going to tell the voters it wants to accomplish? They're not at all, there's no unified view in the DPJ, as I mentioned earlier. The party has all but thrown in the towel on political reform. When I spoke here last year, I was unduly optimistic that really significant changes would take place. I was about in the relationship between politicians and bureaucrats, between the party and the government. Policymaking would be more centered in the government and so on. I was concerned about the naivete that anyone could see in the DPJ's the way the DPJ talked about, the politicians in control and so on. But, now the DPJ and Prime Minister Noda, they basically have thrown in the towel, sort of establishing anew the LDP style of decision making that they were going to change. And I think the DPJ's dependence on the bureaucracy may turn out to be much greater than it has been under the LDP in recent years. In my earlier writings about Japanese politics, my earlier books, I wrote about the success of the LDP. One key reason for the success of the LDP was that it combined street-smart professional politicians who came up from prefectural assemblies and so on, and policy-wise former bureaucrats. And it was this alliance of these former senior bureaucrats, many of whom became prime minister, Ohira and Fukuda and Sato and so on, and these Tojin-ha professional politicians that created a balance with the professional bureaucracy, an alliance between the bureaucracy and the LDP. It wasn't the bureaucracy made all the decisions and the LDP just implemented them. It was a much more complex system, as those of you taking my class are about to find out. But But, you know, this government, they don't have these policy-wise politicians. They got a lot of people who are policy interested, but that's different. Not a lot of experience. There's been no effort to create, you know, if you're not going to rely on the bureaucrats, who are you going to rely on? You think politicians themselves can be experts on all these different issues? It's impossible in any country. You know, they think, a lot of Japanese think that in the US the politicians make all the decisions. That's a fiction. You know, the president has a huge White House staff. Every politician and every member of Congress has a lot of people working for them, a lot of people with economics PhDs, a lot of people who have had a lot of experience in politics, and so forth and so on. A lot of think tanks around Washington where people are waiting for the phone to ring asking them to join the government. In the meantime, they're making all kinds of proposals and trying to help politicians that they want to eventually go to work for, right? In Japan, there are no think tanks worthy of the name. Is there any effort by this government? And in places like Germany, parties have their own think tanks. Do they have in Japan? No. Is there any effort? Is there any consciousness that this would be a useful thing to do? Not really. Now, what do? You'll end up relying on the bureaucrats, and that's exactly where NODA is going. So, lots of problems, right? Now, this prime minister, if you've seen him at all on, you know, TV here, NHK TV, or read about him, you'll recognize that he is sober, deliberate. He's not, to be absolutely frank with you, he's not flaky like Prime Minister Hatoyama, and he's not flamboyant and talking before he thinks like Prime Minister Khan. You know, coming up with one issue and then he runs into trouble, so he forgets about that and moves on to the next. No, I think NODA is, he's pragmatic, he's deliberate, he's consensus-oriented, he's respectful of bureaucrats, he looks for ways to make deals with other politicians. I think he's a much more skillful politician than any we've seen in a number of years, including recent LDP politicians as well. He's really very hardworking. Until he became finance minister, every morning he was at the train station in Chiba Prefecture where he lived. Every morning for several years, you know, sort of talking to the voters. He's humble. A quality that maybe not go overall, you know, may not be all that important in American politics, because you wouldn't find an American politician saying, "I'm a bottom fish. I'm a bottom-feeding fish, and therefore, you know, someone you can trust," which is what, you know, Noda said about himself. I'm not a shiny goldfish. I'm just this bottom-feeding dojo, this kind of, you know, like a catfish. But that goes over big, and you know, that goes over big in Japan, especially right now. People are tired of flamboyant people who promise to do all kinds of things and end up accomplishing very little and getting the country in trouble, like it did with the United States over this Futenma base relocation issue. So I think Noda, you know, his popularity is pretty good right now. But that's true for every incoming prime minister for the last several times, because people want to believe that it's going to be better this time. And then some months later, they get disappointed and it goes downhill. He has the opportunity. I think Japanese welcome him as offering the kind of personality that might be the basis for a period of political stability. And that's what people want, political stability. He may provide that, but the question is, does he come up with new ideas to deal with Japan's problems or not? Maybe, I hope so. There's no sign of it yet. His inaugural speech to the Diet was pretty empty in terms of concrete policy proposals. Now, in the disaster area in Tōhoku, this incredible disaster, 9.0 earthquake, a tsunami that wiped out entire towns, over a 500-kilometer area. The meltdown of a major nuclear power plant in Fukushima. A government in Tokyo whose response was slow and so not fine-tuned to the kinds of problems that these various towns and cities met. But there have been a number of very positive developments that one can see in Tōhoku as a result of this disaster. And one question is how much politicians in Tokyo understand that and can build on it. Three things strike me in particular from my observations there. This disaster has seen the emergence of dynamic local political leaders. It has seen an unprecedented level of business involvement in civic affairs and limited but significant private sector initiatives to restore the Tōhoku economy. And it has seen a blossoming of volunteerism and the strengthening of non-governmental organizations and the growth of a vibrant civil society. So let me just briefly touch on each of these points. So Japan has a parliamentary system, right, at the national level, but it has a system of direct election of governors and mayors in the localities. So governors and mayors are elected directly for 4-year terms. Of course, they have local assemblies they have to contend with, but they're not beholden to their legislatures for their very existence, as the prime minister is to the Diet. If the majority of the members of the Diet don't like the prime minister, they can get rid of him. But if the members of a local assembly don't like their mayor or their governor, they're stuck with them for 4 years. So at the local level, politics is much more like our system. At the national level, it's more like Britain and other parliamentary systems, right? So these local leaders, of course, there's a great deal of variety among them in terms of personality and political skills and so on. But in Tōhoku and around the country, there are lots of governors and mayors who are not hesitant to express their views and criticize the central government and put forth their own ideas about how to rebuild their communities. And unlike politicians in Tokyo, they have administrative experience. They run a government, a local government. They have administrative experience as their government's chief executive and a realistic understanding of what is doable and what is needed because they got their feet on the ground. They're there. And so they understand the issues in a way that bureaucrats and politicians in Tokyo do not. And though, you know, if you go to these different places in Tōhoku, the needs vary from one community to another. But the central government adheres to a kind of one-size-fits-all approach to dealing with problems. And more in Japan, I think, than in other countries. Every country faces this problem, but more so in Japan, is the segmentation of the bureaucracy. Each ministry has its own policy. Coordination is very difficult. There is a very serious coordination problem between these bureaucratic entities and between the local government and Tokyo. And of all the things I've studied over the years about Japan, frankly, I never got all that excited about national-local relations. But now I think that's one of the most important issues in the study of Japanese politics, and one of the most important issues for the Japanese government to deal with. This issue of the relationship, the coordination problem between local governments in Tokyo is in part the result of the halfway decentralization reforms that Japan adopted at the end of the 1990s. In 1999, the Diet adopted a comprehensive decentralization reform program. And the idea was to give localities more autonomy vis-a-vis the central government. But the reality is that the reforms weakened the central government's ability to tell local governments what to do. It weakened the central government's authority over local governments without giving these local governments the resources and the power to act on their own. So it made the coordination problem among national, prefectural, and local governments much more complicated and more cumbersome, and led to lots of irritation on both sides. I can tell you about it later if you're interested. How much people in the DPJ, national officials in the DPJ, so irritated with these local politicians making demands on them. From their point of view, all they do is criticize and ask for money, and they don't take responsibility. And the local politicians' view is, we want to take responsibility, we don't have any money, and we don't really have the power. This is a problem that needs to be confronted, but I don't have any sense that it is being confronted by this government or by the LDP or anybody else for that matter. So those local governments have not been given expanded authority to increase revenue, and they've not been given more no-strings-attached money from the central government coffers. It all comes string-attached. So Japan still has so-called 30% autonomy. Local governments depend on the central government, disbursements for nearly 2/3 of its income. So what's the solution? The solution is not difficult to identify, it's just difficult to do, and that is to adopt far-reaching decentralization reforms. And Tōhoku offers the opportunity for a bold experiment. Create a special economic zone in Miyagi Prefecture in which the central government basically turns over the money and the power to the prefecture and to the local government and to the local authorities, and let them figure out what to do with it. And if they mess it up, it's not going to be that bad for the country as a whole. If it's successful, it sets a new model. I don't think it's going to. I'm pretty sure it's not going to happen, and that's really very, very unfortunate. The DPJ came in talking about local government, local autonomy, so on and so forth, but there's no action to back up their rhetoric. And in Prime Minister Noda's speech to the Diet, his inaugural speech to the Diet, there's just kind of a throwaway line. Oh yeah, we're going to increase local autonomy. No flesh, no meat on these bones whatsoever. And a lot of politicians, and in the LDP and in the DPJ as well, they're not really that enthusiastic about decentralization because by having control over the money, they can get votes. Subsidies translate into voting support. So this is, I think, a huge problem for Japan. Now, in this disaster, it's the private sector that responded quickly and decisively to the disaster. Within days of the earthquake and the tsunami, Japanese automobile manufacturers sent upwards of 2,000 engineers to Tōhoku to assist companies that they depended on for parts to get back into operation. Electronics companies responded with similar speed to get companies that had been knocked offline back in business. There was a severe disruption of so-called supply chains, which people hadn't realized how many parts and sort of components of parts and so on are produced in companies in this area. There was a severe disruption of supply chains, but it has lasted for a much shorter time than almost anybody had anticipated. And the problem is expected now to be totally resolved before the end of the year. So there's been companies, unlike governments, they have to move quickly because otherwise they pay a very high price. They don't do business if there's no business to do, if they don't have parts and so on. Secondly, about the private sector, what's been very impressive is that I think the humanitarian assistance by Japanese companies, indeed by foreign companies in Japan as well, both large and small, humanitarian assistance has been of unprecedented scope. And it continues today, months and months after March 11th. Several firms have set up funds in the $100 million range to support all kinds of activities, humanitarian activities in Tōhoku. Many, many companies, large and small, innumerable companies, large and small, have made large contributions. And having no faith in the ability of the bureaucracy, the government bureaucracy, to distribute these funds quickly and efficiently, businessmen have been channeling their contributions through various nonprofit organizations, or they take the Shinkansen and go up to the town that they're going to give the money to and deliver it right into the hands of the mayor. Lots of small and medium-sized companies have done exactly that. There was one city, I think it was Soma city in Fukushima, where the mayor has on the wall all these names of all the companies that have given money for the city, and there's no space left. There's no room left on the walls. They're covered. Individuals, companies, and individuals as well have provided a lot of money and supplies. You know, I don't think people in this country understand what an outpouring of support there's been from all over Japan for the victims of the tsunami. And everywhere, people have, you know, donated clothes and money and all kinds of supplies to try to help. And so have a lot of foreigners, including, you know, Americans. There's been a lot of money raised, a lot of wonderful, you know, activities undertaken to help support the victims of this disaster. There's also been now well over 1 million volunteers who have gone to Tōhoku. The official government number is about half of that, but those are people whose organizations registered with the government, registered the numbers of volunteers who have come to work for them with the government. But people inside the government have told me that their estimate is that the real number is at least twice that amount. So it's well over 1 million people. You know, this isn't like going from Osaka to Kobe at the time of the Hanshin Awaji earthquake. It's not easy to get up there. It's a long trip. And you know, so many young people in Tokyo on Friday after work, they get on one of these volunteer buses at 10 o'clock at night. They arrive in Ichinomaki or one of these other places, Kisanuma and so on, at 6 o'clock in the morning. They shovel mud all day, sleep in a tent at night, do the same thing the next day, and take the bus on Sunday night and arrive back in Tokyo Monday morning in time to take a shower and go to work. There are lots and lots of people doing this. And you know, these so-called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, in Japan, they've always been very small in numbers and very poor. But now, so many of these NGOs, which have been operating on a shoestring and managing this small number of people, suddenly find themselves inundated with both cash and people. And so there have been all kinds of problems as they struggle to recruit managerial talent and strengthen their infrastructure, better coordinate among themselves with local governments, but they're doing it. It's very impressive to see how these NGOs, they meet, you know, in Ichinomaki, there's, I don't know how many, but every evening the leaders of these various NGOs, 10, 15, 20 different groups, they meet every evening, decide what are we going to do, just have a hanseikai and reflect on what they did that day, what problems they ran into, what they're going to do tomorrow, which organization's going to do what. They try to work with the local government, and a lot of local governments have now gotten confidence in these organizations, so the relationship is improving. This is a major, important, positive development in Japan. So all the negative stories you hear about the national government being so slow and so forth, it's all true. But the role of the private sector, the role of individuals, the role of civil society, and these dynamic local leaders who really know what the problems are and have ideas about how to deal with them. How do you further encourage these developments? That's the issue that this government and this prime minister need to think hard about. So entrepreneurship, risk-taking, individual initiative, and community cohesiveness, that's what's bringing hope to people in Tōhoku. Not the government in Tokyo, not the central bureaucracy. It's these people working at the local level. But there is a pressing need for government policies to foster investment, private sector investment in the tsunami zone that would create jobs and keep young people from fleeing. You know, already about 30% or a little more of the population of this part of Japan is over 65. So young people have been leaving there. There's not a lot of opportunity. Since the disaster, there's been an exodus of young people from there. Of course, from Fukushima, there's been an exodus of people of all ages to get away from the radiation danger. But in Miyagi and Iwate and so on, young people are leaving. Now, so what you're likely to see if these trends continue is that Tōhoku, the disaster area, which altogether accounts, well, Tōhoku itself counts about 4% of Japanese GDP. The areas that were badly affected by the tsunami, less than half of that. So this area could sink back into obscurity. There'll probably still be enough people to catch fish, which is basically what goes on there. And it'll be a poor area. It's already one of the poorest areas of Japan, but it'll be a poor area where old people and some fishermen live. That's what's likely to happen, but that isn't what has to happen. There is an opportunity to revive this area. And it's really not so much a matter of money as incentives. Providing incentives, tax holidays, a company that invests in this area, no corporate tax, no tax for X number of years. There are all kinds of ways for the government to provide incentives for private industry to invest there. Now, some companies are doing it anyway. Toyota has opened a new manufacturing plant in Miyagi. It had been talking about doing it for a number of years, but kept on delaying. But it took this occasion, in this disaster, to say, okay, now we're going to go forward. That kind of activity. There are other companies that have done similar things. That has to be encouraged. And so what has really impressed me about the response in Tōhoku is just the things I've just mentioned. And more than anything else, the strength of social bonds, of community, of people who help themselves and help each other. You know, especially in rural Japan, these communities are very tight-knit. And so people who have grown up in the same village, they really care. They're concerned about each other. They help each other. And every family suffered people getting killed from the tsunami and so on. And this strength of Japanese society is just so extraordinary. I think people all over the world have been impressed. A weak and dysfunctional political system, but a very strong, put-together society in where people help themselves and help each other. That is Japan's strength. Now, what lessons should be drawn from Tōhoku? Again, let me just mention, I think, 4 or 5 points that strike me as being particularly important, and then I'm going to stop talking and let you ask me some questions. The first one is this, maybe a little bit unusual to point to you. I have to use a Japanese word to express it. When the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant melted because the tsunami knocked out all the electrical generators you know, all the generators that fed electricity to the plant. The word that was used was, well, this was totally sotegai. You know this word, sotegai? Beyond expectation, outside what anyone can expect. One of the lessons of Tōhoku that applies to Japanese domestic policy, applies to foreign policy, to relations with China and other countries, is you got to stop thinking that things are sotegai. If you translate sotegai into English, I think what it really means is, let's not think about what we don't want to think about. That's sotegai. Let's not think about what we don't want to think about. It's not a unique Japanese problem. Many years ago, the American futurologist Herman Kahn wrote a book. It was called Thinking the Unthinkable, about nuclear war. Because, you know, nuclear war, that was sotegai. We didn't want to think about it. A nuclear meltdown in a country that's earthquake prone and has nuclear power plants built on fault lines along the ocean, along the coast, you don't think that a major meltdown is sotegai. Prime Minister Kahn told me, I went to see him some months ago when he was still Prime Minister, and he said that, you know, we thought we had very good nuclear safety policies in place, but we had no idea how to deal with radiation fallout. He said the United States has nuclear weapons, and it had to be, you know, it had war, you know, war gaming about nuclear war with the Soviet Union. If there was a nuclear war, there would be nuclear weapons on it, you know, falling and radiation problems. So the Americans really have a lot of expertise, and he called in a lot of American expertise to help deal with the radiation problem. So for Japan, the idea of having to deal with a radiation fallout problem was sotegai. But wait a minute. Japan has an alliance with the United States. Japan relies on the American nuclear umbrella. If there had been a nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union, you think Japan was going to be outside? No. But this was, let's not think about what we don't want to think about kind of mentality. You have to think about what you don't want to think about. You have to think about, does China's growing naval power pose a threat to Japan, especially because of a territorial dispute around about the Senkaku Islands? You can't say this is sotegai. You can't say that the way to deal with it is to simply build up your military and take the Chinese on. That's probably not rational. But you have to think about, how do you deal with these kinds of problems? So I think one of the lessons that should be drawn from this disaster is, you got to get rid of these taboos and not let anything be considered sotegai. You cannot think that a bond market crash in Japan, a fiscal crisis in Japan, is something that's not going to happen. That it's sotegai because we don't want to think about it. Think about it. Sooner or later, it's going to happen if policies don't change. So that's one really big, maybe I think the biggest lesson from this disaster. Change the way you think about think about the unthinkable, and then try to come up with rational policies to deal with these issues. Not think about it, and then have to, in panic, try to deal with it, because that could lead to very dangerous kinds of policies. Second, there needs to be better coordination among these segmented bureaucratic institutions. So now Prime Minister Noda is proposing to establish a reconstruction agency that would coordinate among all the ministries involved in reconstruction in Tōhoku. Hey, it's 6 months after the tsunami. You think they might have done this a little bit more quickly. You also think that the proposal might have some substance to it, exactly how it's going to be done, who's going to be in charge. What's likely to happen is you create a reconstruction agency, and there'll be representatives from each of the ministries in the reconstruction agency, and life will go on as we've known it all along. Third, devolution, the point I made earlier. Decentralization, greater autonomy for local areas. I think this idea of having, you know, replacing the prefectures with these kind of regional, larger governments, yeah, maybe sometime down the road, that may be something to do. I have a lot of doubts about whether that's so desirable, but that's not going to happen tomorrow or next year or the year after, but something should happen tomorrow and next year and the year after. And one way is to experiment with decentralization in Tōhoku. And as I said, I'm not optimistic, but I think it should happen. Next, somewhat related, but separate point. There has to be greater incentives for private investment, both foreign and domestic, in Japan. The government is talking about it, especially about Japanese, you know, because of this yen being so high, the Japanese government is trying to find ways to encourage Japanese business to invest at home. How about foreign business? There's such a low level of foreign direct investment in Japan. But you know, there's so many foreign companies. Many company executives, foreign company executives, have written to me, sent me emails. How can I help in Tōhoku? The governor of Miyagi Prefecture, Governor Murai, who I think is an outstanding political leader, he wants foreign investment in Japan. There are so many obstacles to it. This is the kind of thing that the government can do if it set its mind to reduce these regulations, provide incentives for foreign companies to come into that part of the country and other parts of the country. There are a lot of foreign companies that know well that Japan has a great labor force, all kinds of good conditions. But anyway, there needs to be more of that. And there has to be, I think, more deregulation and the encouragement of greater civil society engagement in dealing with lots of issues. So now let me just conclude with this. Some years back, I wrote a book called The Logic of Japanese Politics. A lot of people thought that the title was an oxymoron, you know, but it's not. There is an inner logic. But the subtitle of that book was Leaders, Institutions, and the Limits of Change. And my talk today is also about the limits of change. Japan is not going to change as quickly or as far and as much as is needed. But it's not just leaders and institutions, as important as they are. Leaders, yes. Japan has a profound problem of leadership recruitment and leadership training. The old system in the LDP is gone. They got to find ways to train people to be real leaders. And that's a problem. Institutions, yes. You know, the ability of the upper house to stymie everything, to kind of veto decisions taken by the other house, is very real, and it's an institutional constraint. But what was missing in my subtitle is this. What is the heart of the problem? I think the heart of the problem is a public that is very risk-averse and that has very unrealistic expectations, wanting to pay low taxes and have extensive government services. That is not possible. If you get a lot of services and the government doesn't get a lot of revenue to pay for them, you get exactly what Japan has, a huge government debt. You either got to find ways to increase the growth rate and produce more revenue that way, increase taxes and produce more revenue that way, or cut back on services. But the idea that you can continue to have a wonderful medical care system and other services and not pay for them, you know, that's simply cannot go on. So but the public is very risk averse. You know, one reason why Mr. Noda is popular is because he's saying that he's not going to do anything very dramatic. And people say, whew, now I can breathe easy. They're tired of dramatic and dramatizing prime ministers, right? So I think at the heart is a risk-averse public with these unrealistic expectations and the absence of political leaders who prepared to take the risk of telling the voters that there are hard and painful choices that need to be made, and these are the choices that I am determined to undertake. And if you don't say that, maybe you can stay around for a while, but it's not good news for Japan. So As I've said on previous occasions, and I've written about, ever since more or less 1990, Japan has been in a long period of political transition, kind of a period of creative destruction. The old system is falling apart, something new is replacing it. But there's not much creativity here in this creative destruction, and I don't see much in the way of new departures and bold initiatives anytime in the near future. But let me conclude on this note. Japan is not collapsing. It's actually, in some ways, not in as bad shape as many assume. And it's a question whether the problems in Japan are worse or not as bad as they are in the United States, not to mention Italy, Spain, or Greece, right? Let's remember, Japan's unemployment rate is about half what it is in the United States. Its income inequalities are growing, and they're serious. Nothing compared to the obscene level of inequality that we see in our own country. And Japan's safe, it's clean, and for most people, it's a very comfortable place to live, which may be one of the reasons why you don't see a lot of enthusiasm for making very fundamental changes. So politics at the national level is pretty dysfunctional, but social bonds are strong, local communities are strong, people help themselves and they help each other. People thought that this disaster in Tōhoku would be the crisis that would galvanize the public and the politicians for major change. The problem is the crisis in Tōhoku is not a crisis for Japan. It's a crisis for Tōhoku. Sadly, it's not a crisis for the country. Its impact on the economy is not that great. Yeah, it'll cost money to rebuild Tōhoku, but it's not really perceived in Tokyo as a crisis. Only one part of the Tōhoku disaster is seen as a crisis. And because it's seen as a crisis, it's forcing policy change. That's the Fukushima nuclear plant issue, and that's forcing a change in energy policy. But the basic economic and social and other policies of Japan are not being fundamentally affected by Tōhoku. So, what's likely to happen? Probably not much until there is a national crisis. A national crisis brought about by its fiscal problems, a national crisis brought about by foreign policy problems, especially perhaps with China. You would hope that there'd be political leaders who would get out in front of these crises and convince the public what it has to do to avoid them. I hope Mr. Noda is that leader. We'll have to wait and see. Thank you.
Jerry, I wanted to ask you about the role of the cabinet secretary and as a position, and also about Mr. Edano himself, who had a very big role to play, especially as it relates to the public during the Tōhoku disaster. And I want to ask you about two things in particular. One, the role of the cabinet secretary as it is legally or officially stated as the coordinator among ministers of various segmented ministries, as you mentioned. But also, as you saw in this Tōhoku disaster, his role as basically the press secretary for the Prime Minister's office. And I'm wondering if your comments about the inability of Japanese politicians to deal with the media, or vice versa, the media's taking off with sort of negative comments on politicians and their activities, have in part to do with the lack of a specialized position in either the ministries or even the cabinet, the Prime Minister's office, for a press secretary the way there is here in the US. And whether or not that role should be rolled into one of the bigger role of what the cabinet secretary is, that is the coordinator among ministries, something that you pointed out in your talk today that is quite deficient today in Japanese politics.
Well, you know, this position of Chief Cabinet Secretary, which Mr. Edano held under the Kan government, and he now is the minister at MEDI, replacing the guy who lasted for 9 days. You know, the Minister of Economic and Industry and Trade. You wonder about these policies. We saw it with in the LDP years ago, but you know, you expect a little bit more from the DPJ. So he goes to Fukushima, and says the 20-kilometer zone around the nuclear plant is a city of the dead. It's a dead city. Nobody died there, but nobody can live there now, and so on and so on. But anyway, and then he joked with some journalists, "Watch out, I'm going to put radiation on you," and went like this. He lost his job. Now Mr. Edano has that job. But the Chief Cabinet Secretary's role is an impossible role for anyone to play. Of course, the cabinet needs a professional press secretary. Moreover, if you visit the Kante, the Japanese equivalent of the White House, the Prime Minister's office, where the Chief Cabinet Secretary sits, there are not a lot of people there. And a lot of them are seconded from the bureaucracy for a period of time. But, the White House has an extensive organization. And they have someone who deals with Congress and someone, the chief of staff and the NSC. There's no NSC in Japan. There's no economic council in the Kante. The Chief Cabinet Secretary can't coordinate these ministries by himself. He's not Superman. So of course they need a press secretary. They need to break down the role of the Chief Cabinet Secretary, and they got to create an infrastructure of human resources inside the Kante to process policy. You cannot do it out of your hip pocket. You can't do it, you're elected, you're chosen as Chief Cabinet Secretary, then you're going to run the government? Give me a break. Nobody can do that. It doesn't happen in any country. And the fact that the Japanese government does, the political leadership, doesn't really focus on the importance of this kind of institutional reform of its home base of the Kante, is an example how much they depended on the bureaucracy to process the policy for them, and then they can make the ultimate decision. But that system doesn't work anymore. So yeah, it's a major, major problem what to do about the Chief Cabinet Secretary's office and that whole organization of the White House, the Kante.
Hirohoshino, the fellow Senator of Japanese Economy and Business and the Professor of Management of Kyushu University, Japan. I stayed 4 weeks after the disaster and attended a government on a disaster response meeting almost every day for 4 weeks, and found completely lacking of coordination between bureaucracies and government, as we mentioned. Although there are always between 30 and 40 people sent from each ministry, but completely lacking of coordination. So could you give us a good proposal to create a well-balanced alliance between bureaucrats and the government for the reconstruction of Tōhoku area?
Well, I've met, when I was up there, I remember one young official from the Ministry of Agriculture who was in this town, and he was so dedicated and trying his best. But he was working not for the town. He was working for the Ministry of Agriculture in the town, right? And he was doing his best to coordinate and so on. I think one way to deal with this is, it goes along with the decentralization. You turn over more power to the local government. You send a team, the government sends a team from the Ministry of Health and Welfare, Agriculture, Land Transportation, and so on. What the ministries that particular town, the expertise they need. And they go there for 2 to 3 years. They're sent to work for the local government. And they report not to their ministry, but to the mayor. And the mayor has now a team of young experts from these different ministries. But their loyalties, their obligations now are not to their ministry. They're to the mayor. That can be done. I've discussed this issue with several people in Japan. There's some enthusiasm for it, but it gets lost. It hasn't gone anywhere. That's one way. The other is to is for the government, Prime Minister Noda, to really establish a strong political coordinating mechanism, this reconstruction agency, in which you're not simply seconding people from all the different ministries to run it, but to be serious about when the cabinet minister of the reconstruction agency says this is what we're going to do, there's no veto power from the other agencies. If they did that, that could make a big difference. But those are very big decisions, and you need a big person in charge who has the imagination and the courage to do it. So again, you hope that Noda is that person.
My name is Kikuchi. Currently, I'm studying at Teachers College, Columbia University. I'm from Japan, and I lost my father in that tsunami. And after the earthquake and tsunami, my father and sister went missing. And as I was living in Nagoya, 500 miles away from the place where my father and sister were living, what made me stressful was there was no strong leader to do this, to do what to Japanese people. And I searched for my father and sister from debris to debris, from shelter to shelter. And fortunately, my sister was found alive 7 days later, but my father found dead 14 days under debris. I was very sad, even now, thinking about my father. And today I'm here to express my sincere gratitude to the U.S. government for sending rescue teams to Iwate Prefecture, where my father and sister are living. And also I want to say thank you to Columbia University for accepting me as a Fulbright visiting scholar at Teachers College. And my question is, Professor Curtis, if you had been Prime Minister of Japan, what have you done in that tsunami and earthquake as Chief Commander? Thank you.
Well, well, first of all, my sympathy to you for your loss. I think that one of the things that so disappointed me with Prime Minister Khan's response was that, one of the roles of a prime minister or of a president is to instill confidence and hope in the public. And that requires communication. It requires a leader who doesn't read from his notes, but talks from his heart and goes on TV or uses other kinds of opportunities to tell the public what the government is trying to do and to try to give some encouragement. When I was actually in Iwate, in Ofunato, there was a businessman he had a fish packing plant that was destroyed by the tsunami. It's 3 factories, they were all destroyed. And he said to me, he said, I don't know, he said, I want to try to recover. I'm trying to borrow money from the bank. I'm using all my savings to try to get back into business again. But I don't know what the government is going to do. I have no idea whether they'll support, whether I spend this money and then they're going to support me, or they're going to say, no, everybody has to move out from that area. I have no idea what they're going to do. He said, I want to hear their words. And I said to him, and this was for a documentary I did on TVASI, and it's included in that particular documentary. I said, do you mean just words is enough? He said, it's not enough, but words are really important. We have to hear from the Prime Minister words that give us hope. That was what was missing. Of course, there are lots of specific things that were missing. You know, these temporary, the people were staying in these evacuation centers, and they were building as quickly as they could these temporary residences, housing, where people can stay for up to 2 years while they figure out how to permanently locate. And you know, a lot of old people in this area, so many elderly people said, I don't want to go to that temporary housing if the other people in my village can't go to the same one. They're afraid of kodokshi, of dying alone, of being in some place where there's nobody that they know. And it was done by lottery. So those who won the lottery, they get to move first. This violates sort of the community ethic and values. So there are lots of things they did wrong, but more than anything, it was this lack of, first of all, communicating with the public, and secondly, communicating to the people who suffered. You know, the Prime Minister didn't visit there for quite some. Now he had his hands full, no doubt, with the Fukushima. Khan was absolutely petrified about what was going on in Fukushima. He told me, and he told the press the other day, they worried that at one point they were worried that more than 30 million people would have to be evacuated, including from Tokyo, because TEPCO, on the 15th of March, said they're just going to leave because it was too dangerous, and they threw up their hands. So he had his hands full, no doubt, but there wasn't enough of communication. You know, and who was the most impressive figure in terms of communicating real concern and providing a sense of hope? It was the emperor and empress. And when they visited Iwate, and they made another trip to Fukushima, 48 trips there. And someone pointed out to me, which I thought was so interesting. You know the word in Japanese, ganbatte. So Khan would go up there, and other politicians would go and say, ganbatte kudasai ne. And the emperor, he never said that. He would go and sit on the floor. And he'd say, Yoku ganbarimashita ne. That sense of appreciation for what these people have been through. It's not ganbatte, you can do it, hang in there, try hard. These are people who suffered the loss of their fathers, their daughters, and so on and so forth. Well, I got two. That is what was missing. I think, frankly, that's still what is missing. You know, I don't know him all that well, but I know Prime Minister Noda. I like him. He's a very decent human being. But you know, his speech, the Diet, it's filled with a lot of cliches about helping Tōhoku. But where is the real? Is this message going to make people say, "Oh, thank God we have a government in place that is really going to try to do things for us"? I don't think so, and that's the big problem. So yeah, there are lots of specific things that could have been done differently and better, and the government could have acted faster, and there could have been greater coordination. But I think at the end of the day, what was most missing, and what is the biggest problem, is the government lost its credibility. No one trusts what it says about the radiation danger, because first of all, no one trusts TEPCO, because TEPCO has lied through its teeth, or it didn't know what was going on. But I think and a lot of stuff it didn't know, it didn't say. The government didn't have a handle on this issue, so it's lost its credibility, and it doesn't convey this sense of hope. Yeah, so I think that was the biggest problem.
I'm embarrassed to ask a banal question after those two very moving statements, but the question I was going to ask is, you mentioned in your talk, many times you referred to deregulation as a means of recovery, but you also kept talking about the risk aversion of the general public, and to me these two things kind of cancel each other out. I tend to think, at least in my world of finance and the economy, that the bureaucrats have done a very good job deregulating, and yet when there is a kind of refusal by the private sector to accept change, it somehow doesn't happen. For example, the laws about takeovers have been have been eased a lot, and Mr. Saito at the Tokyo Stock Exchange has put many things in place that really improve corporate governance, but we don't see Japanese companies really being more responsive to market discipline or the shareholders. My question is, how do you make the government not only lead the horse to water, but force it to drink? What can they do? What can they do to help the private sector over its prejudices? I mean, accepting foreign and direct investment will be a big change, right?
Well, I don't think the government can do much more than lead the horse to the water. And if the horse doesn't drink and dies of thirst and starvation, then the horse has a big problem. But at least lead him to the well, right? That needs to be done. And yes, in your world of finance and so on, there's been a lot of deregulation, to be sure. But in other worlds of manufacturing and so on, there's not been a lot of deregulation. There's a lot of regulation. There's a lot of regulation. Japan is an aging society. Lots of old people who are going to need more and more care, assisted living care, nursing home care. Because of this emphasis on equality in Japan, the number of kaigo beds, the number of nursing home beds or assisted living facilities that you can have in any town are limited by law so that everybody has an equal chance. So a city like the one I lived in when I was young, Beppu in Kyushu, in Oita Prefecture, that should be like, southern Florida or Arizona with lots of assisted living facilities. And I'd be visiting with the mayor there, and he said, that's exactly what they want to do. But they can't because of regulations that limit the number of assisted living facilities you can create in any one city. This is crazy. This should be changed. And then whether some company invests and actually builds a facility like that, that's a business decision, which the government has no role in deciding, but it can provide incentives. There are all kinds of incentives. There are all kinds of incentives you could provide to foreign companies that would like to invest in Tōhoku, but they're not there. So I still think there's a big role for deregulation.
I am Jerry's wife. I'm not a political scientist, but I've been married to my husband who studies about Japan for so many years.
Long time.
And from now, I'm going to change to Japanese because I can express myself in Japanese.
No, you can't.
No? Okay.
Well, we can talk later, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I have been to the Tōhoku. I have been to the Tōhoku, and I saw that area. And I am very sorry to you, and I feel for you. And I have a favor for the Japanese students here who are studying at Columbia. Every time when I go back to Japan, Japan is becoming more and more manual country. Like you listen to boss and whatever. And you can only move for the guidance. When you graduate and become seijin, 偉くなった時, I would like you to use your imagination, and I would like to be creative, and I hope you will lead Japan as a good leader, and I hope you will be courageous and trust your own belief. And I'm really hoping and believing Japan will be okay.
Well, that's very difficult to follow. But I think what I was going to comment on was related to the media situation. And you've been very harsh with the Japanese media, and I do think a number of these, I have huge criticisms about a lot of aspects of Japanese media. But the situation in newspapers and the situation in television are quite different. And I also think that it's scary to listen to your talk today about the media, because it's exactly like the United States media. And one of the challenges I would like to offer to the School of International and Public Affairs and the Weatherhead Institute and the Economy Center is I have been calling for many years for you to take as a major subject for your study, for your symposiums, for your lecture series, and for your exchanges, the question of communication through this, the world of the media, which is now so important. It's changed to the internet, to the cell phones, to Skype, to television and so forth. But there is a great deal of television exchange of ideas on Japanese TV. Every Sunday is full of, and evenings on the cable is full of debates about many of the issues that you brought up. It's not as if they aren't. And our television is also full of personality detritus, terrible stuff. So we need to find some answers as seriously, bilingually, I mean binationally, and this deserves a full focus for your next challenge for your conferences or whatever it may be, because this has not changed in the past 10 to 15 years, and I hear this in your remarks almost every year about how the media is not doing its job. So I hope that you will foresee some way that we can have it through the journalism school as well here, some better dialogue between Japanese media and so forth. And I want to know whether you, Jerry, I know you talk to all these people and so forth, but do you ever issue policy statements do you ever write out policy statements such as the list that you had, lessons to learn from Tōhoku and so forth? Do you ever submit them to, for example, Prime Minister Noda or to the new people, or is it mostly oral?
Well,
because it's very easy to, forget about conversations, but it's not easy in Japan especially to dismiss a written proposal that comes to your desk.
Well, today NHK recorded this whole thing, and it's supposed to be on the evening news. So let's hope they pick out.
But that's a media. That's not a.
Well, you can write proposals to government officials, whether it be here or in Japan. It doesn't. I'm not sure that it's all that's going to be very effective. There has, an individual writing a letter to the Prime Minister, as me or anybody else. And with proposals, no, I don't think that's frankly all that effective. Policy is, the policy is made it's like a sausage factory, right? It's a very complex, oftentimes not very pretty picture, but you have to have a system in place to produce the policy. If you don't have a system, I can talk or write a policy proposal to the Prime Minister or somebody else can, but that's not the way to make policy. And we're kidding ourselves if we think that we have real influence that way. I don't believe that for a minute. The government needs a better system in place to make policy. It doesn't have it. That's the problem.
Maybe the issue really is how to make policy proposals, how to improve the system. I think that this issue of media is, in a sense, important to all of us substantively and personally. I happened to be in Tokyo at the time of the earthquake, and I was talking with Barbara Rush about the way it was being covered in the United States versus the way it was being covered in Japan. And there was a huge difference, because she was watching both Japanese TV and American TV, and I was sitting in Tokyo. And I was trying to decide whether to get out of Tokyo because of radiation, and nobody knew those first few days. And Barbara was essentially horrified at the sensationalist, everything is terrible coverage for about 2 weeks in Japan, and then we returned to our usual American non-coverage of Japan. And so I think there are huge media problems in both countries, and it's a challenge. I think we're fortunate at least that we have a free media, and that we have free modes of communication and all of the new methods of communication, which in a sense are terribly important, dramatic change, I think, in the way societies are going to be organized. And I'm thinking about particularly the role of the internet and the communications among the younger members of our audience compared to you and me.
Well, one final word on this media issue. Yeah, there's media problems in the U.S., in Japan, and Britain, and everywhere else. So this is not a unique problem. But there are aspects of the Japanese media problem that are different. The press club system in Japan is an antiquated system that has no place in the 21st century. These burasagari press conferences, you know, where these young reporters in the Kante have this short interview with the Prime Minister every day. First of all, these are really green reporters. This is how they get trained. Are they going to ask a really difficult question of the Prime Minister? Are they going to really put him, you know, do something that the other reporters, ask something the other reporters wouldn't ask? No. So this is not very meaningful. And there's a kind of a herd mentality. All these reporters they go together. They go to these press clubs. They go to the, yomawari, going at night to wait outside the politician's house, have an interview when he comes home. They're all in it together. This system it's really not appropriate any longer. It should be changed. The cartel of the Japanese media should be changed. Actually, the DPJ tried at the beginning to break down the press clubs by letting in non-members into the press conferences. But the media, the established media, reacted against it. So every country has its own problem. We have different problems in the U.S. The high politicization of cable TV, Fox TV at one side, MSNBC on the other, and so forth. So where's the neutral journalism as providing information to the audience without editorializing on it all the time? What's being lost, right? So yeah, of course there are problems in all countries. Japan has its problems. They should try to deal with them. We have our problems. We need to deal with ours. Some of them are similar. Some of them are quite different. But yeah, this basic problem of communication between the government, political leaders, and the public, that's very big. But I must say, in spite of all, we have so many problems in this country. But if you read the newspaper, probably even if you just watch TV, but if you read the newspaper, what is in the Obama Jobs for America program? What is it about? Why are the Republicans opposed to it? It's not about this faction of the Republican Party is favoring it because they see a way to overcome another faction of the Republican. But that's the way these issues get treated in Japan. So the treatment of NODA's, of the tax commission's proposal for a temporary tax increase in Japan is this group in the DPJ is going to oppose it because Ozawa doesn't want to agree with NODA and so on. That's not what this is about. This is supposed to be about what's in the national interest. What do you need to do policy-wise? That's what the media should be focusing on, but I don't think they are. That was my only point.
Thank you very much, Gerald.